As I mentioned yesterday, Volume 1 only deals with one part of this system. It really starts with money, and the conversion of money into money capital goes through the purchase of labor power and means of production through valorization, production of commodities, and gets to here and then stops. So Volume 1 then is this piece of the totality up to this point. And the core of what Volume 1 about is, of course, the process of valorization and production, which is the production of value and surplus value. Now, the definition of capital in Marx is value in motion, which means that we have to first off start with understanding what is meant by value. And the theory of value in Marx is a much contested issue. I wrote a short paper about it, which is in the Dropbox, so you can see my kind of take on it. So I'll just go over part of what that's about. The labor theory of value. When you hear accounts of what Marx said, everybody says he held to a labor theory of value. But I can find no place in Marx where Marx mentions the labor theory of value. So you say, well, how did people come to the conclusion that Marx is talking about the labor theory of value when Marx never uses the term? And what term does Marx use? Marx says, I have a value theory. Well, the value theory is different from a labor theory of value. So one of the big questions is, what ways is the labor theory of value different from the value theory? And where did the labor theory of value come from? The labor theory of value comes from Ricardo. And Ricardo recognized that all wealth had its origin in human labor, which led Ricardo to certain paradoxes and difficulties. One of the paradoxes was an obvious one. If all value comes from labor, then how come the laborers are so poor and the capitalists are so rich? If all value comes from labor, then how does that value convert itself into the prices of commodities? So Ricardo had a lot of problems of that kind, but he was after labor theory of value and was particularly interested in a labor theory of value that would explain relative prices. In other words, what Ricardo was into was saying something is more valuable than something else because it congeals more labor. But again, there was a problem here. What kind of labor are we talking about? Well, it's labor time. But then he was also faced with the problem, well, that would mean the more time I spend on making something, the more valuable it is. And if I spend 5 days making one shirt, then I should get 5 days worth of labor equivalent for spending my 5 days on it, no matter that there are all those shirts in the market which can be had for one. So Ricardo was running into problems all over the place with his labor theory of value, but he recognized it was absolutely crucial to understanding the dynamics of a capitalist system. So Marx, of course, reads Ricardo and reads Adam Smith and all the rest of it, and is faced with a political economy in which the labor theory of value has a certain central position. Now, the interesting thing here is that Marx wrote his volumes of Capital as a critique of classical political economy. And as a critique, it was obviously going to, criticize, reformulate, reconfigure what classical political economy was about. So when he starts looking at the Ricardo and the value theory in Ricardo, is Marx going to take it all over and say this is unproblematic? Well, it was problematic for Ricardo. Well, of course, it was completely problematic for Marx. So Marx is actually starting off Volume 1 of Capital with a critique, in effect, of Ricardo's labor theory of value. But he obviously kind of says, Ricardo was not an idiot. He was not stupid. He understood something very important about the dynamics of capital. So we start to look at foundational question of commodity exchange. So capital starts with the question of commodity exchange, and Marx asks the question, how does commodity exchange and the act of commodity exchange produce some sort of notion of value? And this is, I think, very important, because Marx is not going to say that value is arrived at through some sort of mental kind of process or idealist kind of conception or some, intellectual activity. Marx, from the middle of the 1840s onwards, said basically value has to be produced through some material action. And it is therefore historical materialist action. The materialist action that produces value is the act of exchange. Not a single act of exchange, but many acts of exchange. So, and it's being the exchange of commodities. And that's why Marx starts Volume 1 of Capital with the notion of the commodity. Earlier on, he started with notions of money, or some cases, labour. But in Capital, he's come to the point saying, I'm going to start with commodity and commodity exchange. And that's my starting point. And that is a conclusion he reached out of all his preparatory, that this is the best place to start. Now, the interesting thing about the commodity is this, that it is the universal of capital. And it doesn't matter, whether you're male or female, or whether you're black or white, or what your sexual preference is, none of this, all of us are consuming commodities. And Marx is going to ask questions about commodities, which allows him to therefore say, what's the nature of commodity exchange, and how historically did commodity exchange come to the point where it became, if you like, the foundation of how we live our lives, how we make our lives, how we eat, how we drink, how we sleep, everything. So he starts with the commodity. And he says the commodity has a use value. Lots of different use values. And they're very specific and particular. It also has an exchange value. And the exchange value, you're talking about something which is characteristic of all commodities. So he starts by saying exchange value. Can you derive exchange values from use value? And Marx says, no, you can't, because the more useful the thing, the more it should be valuable in exchange, but that's patently not the case. Water is a very useful thing, but in his time basically had no exchange value. Does now, of course. So he kind of says basically you can't derive exchange value from a study of use values. Something else must describe what is use value. And here he goes to Ricardo and says, well, Ricardo says it's labour time. Ricardo gets it all wrong by saying labour time, because Ricardo doesn't recognize the difference between labour time and socially necessary labour time. What is socially necessary labour time? Well, it's an abstraction which comes from many exchanges going on, which say the average time it takes to produce a shirt is, 3.5 hours, and that's the measure of socially necessary labour time. Some shirts will take 8 hours, some shirts will take 3 hours, but social average is the abstract value. So Marx distinguishes between what kind of labour is embodied in commodities: concrete labour versus abstract labour, real time or socially necessary labour time. So you have two notions of temporality: real time and socially necessary labour time. So Marx then kind of says, all right, we'll accept Ricardo's notion, except that Ricardo doesn't really understand what's meant by socially necessary. And much of the rest of Capital, I think, is taken up with an analysis of what is socially necessary. And that is a complex kind of question, and actually it expands as you go through. So Marx starts off with all of this. So, in effect, what he does is to say, when Capital when exchange becomes a normal social act, there are some conditions that must apply for it to be a normal social act. It has to be a proliferation of a lot of exchange of similar products. It has to be generalized. It can't be generalized unless there are mechanisms available, such as market process, which is going to actually bring all commodities together and make them all interchangeable. And in the middle of it, there is a necessity for the rise of a money form. So the first thing that's socially necessary is the rise of the money form. And the money form, of course, allows all kinds of intricate exchanges so that barter, which is kind of, one-on-one, can become proliferating, and we can simply exchange money, then use the money wherever we want. So the rise of the money form becomes absolutely crucial. And it's the rise of the money form that actually produces value as a regulatory norm. Now this is something that's very significant for Marx, which is that value is one thing, money is another. Money, he says, is the expression of value or the representation of value. Value cannot exist without its representation. And this is where people get things kind of confused and wrong. And in the paper I kind of said, look, if we wanted to study the circulation of the blood, we couldn't do it without imagining that that is embedded in a human body. And we cannot imagine a human body without the circulation of the blood. And Marx is saying value arises because of a system of some kind which makes value absolutely crucial. So when we're talking about the circulation of value, we're talking, as it were, about the equivalent of the circulation of blood inside of a much more organic thing which allows us and allows the circulation of blood to occur. If there was no body, then there could be no circulation of blood. Same thing here. This value cannot exist without this system. It cannot be outside of it. It cannot exist without this being constructed. This whole system. So this is one of the first points that's made. Now, one of the things I did in the book, which I think is very important, is to recognize, and this is not being done very well, I think, to recognize that there's a world of difference between value and its representation as money. Value, says Marx, is immaterial but objective. It's a social relation. Therefore, you cannot measure it directly. And as a social relation, it is about the sociality of human labor and what the meaning of human labor is. And as it's immaterial but objective, I mean, Marx is very explicit about this in the first few chapters. He says it's immaterial but objective. And he says value does not go around, with a sort of sign saying what it is. But it's there as a regulatory norm, and it's a social relation. And the social relation is important. And when you say it's immaterial but objective, you kind of say this is very, most people think this is very strange when they first encounter Marx, because Marx is generally depicted as being a materialist. Right? And then you find his foundational concept, which is value, is immaterial. So what's going on here? Well, Marx is a historical materialist, not a physical materialist. And the historical materialism is that the creation of commodity exchange, its mediation through the rise of the monetary forms, and then subsequently its connectivity to the circulation of capital, this circulation kind of process we're looking at here, its connectivity to that then becomes the foundation for what value is all about. So value as a regulatory norm comes into existence only as capital circulation comes into existence. They come into existence together. That in, say, 15 or 1600, when the circulatory process was not kind of quite crystallized out in this kind of way, the value form did not exist. It did not exist prior to the circulation of capital. As the circulation of capital became hegemonic and dominant, and as capitalists started to dominate the production of commodities through the buying and selling of labor power, only then does the value form really crystallize out as the regulatory norm for how that society will operate. Get the story. I mean, this is Marx's historical materialism. That the historical transformation of the monetary form, divisions of labor, rise of capital, all those kinds of things, don't precede the creation of the value. They do precede the creation of the value form as the regulatory norm for a capitalist system. And the first 6 chapters of Volume 1 of Capital take you through, okay, we specify our discussion of Ricardo, we alter his labor time into socially necessary labor time. That then gets embedded in a system which involves private property, market exchange, regulatory structures of various kinds of a very sophisticated market, the rise of a monetary form, which is going to facilitate multiple exchanges all over the world and all the rest of it. Then, of course, comes the rise of the capitalist who comes in here with money and starts to make more money by this kind of mechanism. And then we move to a society where everything which you use is produced as a commodity under the social relations of capitalism, which means, in effect, under a regime where value has become the regulatory norm. And that is what the first 6 chapters of Capital does. And then what's interesting is the discussion of value disappears. Then Marx goes and says, all right, this is what happens in the market. And I'm just dealing with the market here. But now I'm going to go into the realm of production. So he dives into valorization. And much of the rest of Capital is a description of what goes on internal to valorization. But what goes on there is not independent of the value form. And there was a brilliant essay written some time ago by Diane Elson called, not the labor theory of value, but the value theory of labor, in which she pointed out, quite correctly in my view, that what Marx is interested in is what are the effects on the laborer and the laborer's work and the laborer's life of living in a world where the regulatory norm of exchange is defined by value. In other words, what's the impact of the value system that Marx has defined upon the life and labor of working people? Now, this was a bit of a revolutionary moment here, because up until Elson wrote this piece, most people tended to accept the view that the role of value theory was to understand the formation of market prices, which was, of course, Ricardo's problem. And Elson said, no, it's not that at all. The interest Marx has in the value theory is what is the consequences for the laborer of living and working under a system which is where the regulatory norm is fixed by value. And that's what Elson said. Now, a priori, given what you know about Marx and his interests, do you think he's more interested in relative prices or in the life and work of the working class? I think that's a no-brainer. Obviously, Marx is interested in trying to explain why it is the workers live and work under certain constraints. And that is explaining Ricardo's big moral problem, which is to explain why, if all wealth originates with labor, how come the workers live and work under such appalling circumstances. That was Ricardo's moral problem, and Ricardo was very concerned about that moral problem, and it gave rise to a whole movement in the 1830s and 1840s called Ricardian socialism, where the socialists were saying, we can't live in a society where labour is the source of all wealth, and yet the labourers are living under these kinds of conditions. So the Ricardian socialists were trying to find an answer to why this conundrum existed and what the source of it was. Marx goes right to the head of it and says, the answer is that the value theory is formed in this particular way, and the value theory puts pressure upon individual capitalists to make sure that the workers never can live and work under reasonable conditions. So this is what Marx is doing here. He's answering Ricardo's problem. He's dealing critically with the Ricardian socialists and saying it's obvious what the nature of the problem is here. And it's obvious because what happens is that capitalists, and this is where Marx introduces some other notions, are in competition with each other. And if I'm competing with you to produce value and surplus value in the market, and I can actually make my workers work for 10 or 15 hours a day, and you can only make your workers work for 6 hours a day, who makes more profit? Who comes out ahead? Who wins in the competitive battle? Well, the person who extends the working day. So you have chapter 10 of volume 1 of Capital, where Marx talks about the length of the working day. And in effect his argument is the value of labour power is fixed by the value of the commodities needed to reproduce the labourer at a given standard of living. The value of labour power is fixed by that standard, whatever it is. And Marx accepts it can vary over time and over space. But, he says, for a given situation, we assume it's given. And if labourers can produce the equivalent value to their labour power in 4 hours, but work for 10, then in effect they're working 6 hours free for the labour, for capital. They're producing the surplus value. This is where surplus value and profit comes from. It comes from workers working beyond what it would really take to produce the equivalence of their own value. And this is Marx's theory of surplus value. So he says, well, this is an obvious way, and the more hours you work, the more surplus value. If every worker can reproduce the value of their labour power in 4 hours, then if they work for 6 hours, you get 2 hours of surplus value, if they, etc. So there is a competitive intensity, he says, for individual capitalists to lengthen the working day as long as possible and to intensify the rhythms of work as much as possible. So then the ones who come out in ahead are those who have the highest intensity and the longest working day. But the consequence of that is, if all the workers are working for, say, 12 hours a day, they're likely to be very unhealthy. And Marx kind of says, here's a problem. Individual capitalists working in competition with each other are likely to produce a result which is very harmful to the reproduction of capital. Because you can start killing off your workers. You work them so hard, you work them to death. And if you work your workers to death, at some point or other, you have no workers. So what's going to happen then? Now, there is actually a form of death which is recorded now in China, and it's recorded also in Japan, which is called death from overwork. So death from, and Marx actually in the chapter on the working day talks about examples of death from overwork, as described by some of the factory inspectors and so on. So this is here's an interesting thing. The class perspective says you shouldn't lengthen the working day beyond the point at which it is going to threaten the life and health of the working class. Individually, no individual capitalist is going to do that. Is going to accept that limitation. So, says Marx, there's going to have to be some sort of way in which you regulate capital, and so you get the movement to restrict the length of the working day from 12 hours to 10 hours, etc., right way down to 8 hours, and all the rest of it. And that is the only way in which you can actually preserve the class interest while continuing with the individual interest as part and parcel of the pressure. But this only arises. This only arises because of the existence of this regulatory norm, which says in the market we are in competition, and it is value in the market which is crucial. And that value, of course, is going to be represented by market price, by the money form. So, if there are limits of the length of the working day, then you switch from what Marx calls absolute surplus value to the long chapters on relative surplus value. Exactly the same mechanism we're talking about in the working day applies here. That if I can take some organizational form or some technology and it is of higher productivity than you, then I will get a relative surplus value out of my superior organizational form or my superior technology. So there arises, again, out of this immaterial force, which we call value theory, there arises this tremendous kind of push for technological and organizational change. And what Marx says, okay, there are forms of organization out there that actually the workers have, but we can appropriate them and then reshape them to capitalist purposes. And the first chapter deals with cooperation. Marx does not say capital invented cooperation. As Marx says, no, cooperation has gone on since the building of the pyramids, and humanity has long ago found ways. They say cooperation is helpful to do certain things which you cannot do simply in organizational cooperation. So he says cooperation is an inherent power of labor. But, he says, it's appropriated by capital and transformed in such a way that it appears as if it is the power of capital. That laborers are stupid and they don't know how to cooperate until capital comes in and organizes them into gangs and foremen and all this kind of stuff. And again, something we mentioned yesterday, what happens here is that an ancient form gets transformed into a very capitalistic form when it is there taken as the power of labor. The same thing happens with divisions of labor. Division of labor has been a long-standing practice in human societies. And again, what capital does is to take them over and then turn it into as if it is their specific power. And takes it over. But again, the division of labor is going to be pushed by competition around value. And it is competition around this immaterial element, which is value, which becomes absolutely crucial. So when you look at what's happening in capital, you say the first 6 chapters are about the formation of this regulatory norm through market exchange. The next chapters are about the consequences of the operation of that regulatory norm for the life and work of the working classes, which solves Ricardo's dilemma and explains it. But it also has political consequences. Because it says basically, you're not going to be able to reform this system as the Ricardian socialists hoped. You're not going to be able to reform this system without challenging the domination of the value form. and that actually socialism has to be about the abolition of the capitalist value form, which is not necessarily the abolition of all value forms. In fact, we can imagine all sorts of other values which can exist. But specifically, the kind of, the socialist Ricardians, he said, are barking up the wrong tree. They're imagining that somehow or other they can transform things by redistributing wealth in some way or other, by by social democratic redistributive means, if you like. I mean, that's what they were moving towards. And in a sense, the whole notion of social democracy comes out of the Ricardian socialist tradition, which is to say, if labour is a source of wealth, then we should redistribute in such a way as to redistribute some of that surplus back to labour through state action and all the rest of it. But Marx is kind of saying, no, a real revolutionary solution has to go to the hegemony and the domination of the value form over the life and labour of the working people. So this is, if you like, the heart of what a lot of Volume 1 is about. What Marx then does is to say, well, how does this affect the macroeconomic kind of process? In other words, we've been looking at individual labour workers and individual capitalists and what they're doing. We're looking at that. Now we need to look at what the consequences are for society in general. And he produces some chapters here which are significant. The first is, he says, I'm going to try and explain what the effects of all this are on the macroeconomic condition in a society where there is no accumulation. Notice this. Both in Volume 1 and Volume 2, Marx has chapters about the reproduction of society without accumulation, what he calls simple reproduction, both in Volume 1 and Volume 2. We're going to study simple reproduction, i.e. a society which is in a steady state with no accumulation. In other words, we're going to study the cyclical form of this. But then, of course, he says, actually capital can never be about the cyclical form, it's got to be about the spiral form. So the next chapter is, all right, what happens when there's accumulation? This also happens in Volume 2. Now, I think it's significant that Marx's study of simple reproduction is much more sophisticated and much lengthier than his studies of the spiral form. Particularly in Volume 2, that becomes true. The spiral form is very weakly explored in Volume 2. In Volume 1, it is more explicitly set out. But it is explicitly set out under conditions where Marx is kind of saying, all right, we've got the creation of the value form, which is this immaterial regulator of material activity. We've got that, and we now understand where it comes from and why it becomes dominant historically within the formation of capitalist society. We've now understood what its consequences are for the life and labour of the worker. Now we have to look at the consequences for capitalist society in general. But we're going to look at the consequences as if none of the other features of this system work. And that is an assumption I mentioned yesterday is very significant. But he's explicit about this. And I've lost count of the number of times I've had arguments with sophisticated Marxist analysts who kind of say, no, I said, no, Marx is very explicit about this. And in the book, second chapter, I kind of laid this out where Marx does this, which is in Volume 1 of Capital. So let me read it to you. He says, the first condition of accumulation is that the capitalist must have contrived to sell his commodities and to reconvert into capital the greater part of the money received from their sale. In the following pages of Volume 1 of Capital, we shall assume that capital passes through its process of circulation in the normal way. Normal way? I don't know what a normal way is. What it basically means is, I assume it can get around here without any problem. That's what it in effect means. That once we get up to the realization of value in money form, it can be realized in money form, it can be distributed, it can come back into here as money capital, it'll take the circular form. She says the detailed analysis of this process will be found in Volume 2. Okay, so don't think I'm not going to deal with it. I'm going to deal with it, but somewhere else. The capitalist who produces surplus value is by no means his ultimate proprietor. He has to share it afterwards with capitalists who fulfill other functions in social reproduction taken as a whole. Notice his statement here, social reproduction taken as a whole. This is a concept which comes back in Capital, and when I kind of sort of talk about Marx and totality, this is the kind of phrases that give, I think, legitimacy to what I'm doing. Surplus value, he said, is therefore split up into various parts. Its fragments fall to various categories of person and take on various mutually independent forms, such as profit, which is over here, profit of the industrial capitalist, interest, gains made through trade, that is the merchant capitalist, ground rent, etc. We shall be able to deal with these modified forms of surplus value only in Volume 3. All right, okay, he's telling us what's going to be in Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. On the one hand, then, we assume here, that is in Volume 1, that the capitalist sells the commodities he has produced at their value. That is, there's no problem of realization. On the other hand, we treat the capitalist producer as the owner of the entire surplus value, or perhaps better, as the representative of all of those who will share the booty with him. That is, we're not going to concern ourselves with the distribution relations. So Marx makes these, he's very explicit in Volume 1. But then what he shows in Volume 1 is that the coercive laws of competition, first off, one of the things they do is they force capital to accumulate. And this is important. That is, the movement into the spiral form is not a free choice. It is produced by competition over control and production of value. So that in order to keep control over the production and circulation of value, you have to actually reinvest. And you actually start in these chapters to feel a bit sorry for the capitalist. Poor capitalists, they want to enjoy themselves. They want to go out and spend all the money and just fritter it away. But they're mandated to reinvest. And Marx kind of has a joke about this in the sense that he says, well, from this there arises the notion that somehow or other the capitalist is refraining from consumption and is restraining themselves from consumption voluntarily, and that they are noble and virtuous, and so there's a production of a notion of bourgeois virtue, which is the capitalist who, when they get a little bit of capital, don't spend it on themselves, they save it, and then they actually expand their thing. And this was the kind of Quaker, Protestant ethic kind of story about the rise of capitalism, which there was an element of truth to some of that. But Marx kind of says, but it doesn't take the capitalists long to figure out that they can actually reinvest and have a really good time at the same time. And so don't feel too sorry for the capitalists that they're forced to reinvest. But they are forced to reinvest. That is, they are forced to accumulate. As they accumulate, what does this mean? If they accumulate, then they need more labor. They're going to come around here and they're going to say, where's the extra labor power? Where's the means of production? Therefore, capital needs to produce a reserve army of labor, a pool of labor over here, that is living and dying to be employed. At the same time, we have to produce surpluses of means of production, which can be surpluses of raw material and all this kind of things here, so that when the capitalist comes back around here with more money and more value, they've got money, they've expanded it, and so this whole thing has to be expansion. So all of these elements have to be in expansion. So Marx then talks about the dynamic where the capitalist mode of production produces a relative surplus population. That is, the pool of labour power has to be in front of the accumulation process. It cannot be behind. And so capitalism as a system produces this relative surplus population, which means, interestingly, it must produce unemployment. And it must produce unemployment at a rate of remuneration which is so low that capitalists will accept almost any job, that workers will accept almost any job you offer at whatever wage. So the control of the wage labour force, and here Marx is interesting, he said, it's interesting, capitalists control both the demand for capital by their reinvestment, they also produce the supply of capital. Because one of the ways in which you can create an industrial reserve army is through technological change. You would throw people out of work because the new technologies only need 100 labourers instead of 1,000. You've got 900 labourers sitting out there unemployed. So this is one of the ways in which capital can control both the demand and supply of labour, which again, by the way, explains why Marx does not like to talk about demand and supply as somehow or other being conditions of free markets, because in the labour market, demand and supply are controlled on both sides by capital. So then what Marx does is to say something interesting. He says, I'm not only interested in the conditions of labour, and much of those chapters on the working day and cooperation and division of labour and machinery and modern industry are about conditions of labour in the factory. I'm not only interested in that, I'm also interested in the standard of living of the workers. And what is it that controls the standard of living of workers? Well, it's about the conditions of reproduction of the industrial reserve army. So the last part of chapter 25 starts to talk not about what's going on in here, which is what the core of those chapters I'm talking about is about, but what goes on over here. So that the value theory of labour is not simply defining this, it also starts to define what the conditions of reproduction of labour power are. And in particular, in chapter 25, we have an intensive description of the conditions of reproduction of the labour power. Let me read you something from the paper I wrote, which you can check out in chapter 25. What Marx does is, again, rely here on the reports of the factory inspectors and health inspectors and the rest of it across Europe and also in Britain. He cites a study of the conditions of life of the majority of workers in Belgium. And he points out that they find themselves forced to live more economically than prisoners in the jails. Now this is an interesting thing, because in the United States we've had situations that have been documented in which people who've been in jail go out and try and live outside, get so frustrated they commit a crime and go back into jail. The response of the system then is to make life so intolerable in the jail that they will not do such things. But the point here is that conditions of daily life back on the street are often worse than they are. Okay, thanks. Are often worse. And so what Marx then does is to describe what this was like in Belgium. He said, workers in Belgium adopt expedients whose secrets are only known to them. They reduce their daily rations. They substitute rye bread for wheat. They eat less meat, or even none at all. And the same with butter and condiments. They content themselves with 1 or 2 rooms where the family is crammed together, where boys and girls sleep side by side, often on the same mattress. They economize on clothing, washing and decency. They give up the diversions on Sunday. In short, they resign themselves to the most painful privations. Once this extreme limit has been reached, the least rise in the price of food, the shortest stoppage of work, the slightest illness, increases the worker's distress and brings him to complete disaster. Debts accumulate, credit fails, the most necessary clothes and furniture are pawned, and finally the family asks to be enrolled in the list of paupers. Now, what Marx is talking about here is conditions of social reproduction. And the value theory is not only about, then, a value theory of labour in the sense of what its conditions of labour are. It's also about the conditions of life and the conditions of social reproduction under which the labour force increasingly is made to exist. And this is, if you like, a very general point I would want to make about Marx's value theory. That if we turn it around and say Marx is not talking about a labour theory of value, or if he is, he's simply talking about it in a critical way around Ricardo in the first 6 chapters of Capital. What he's then doing is turning it into a value theory of labour, which explains what it's like to work under this system and what it's like to live under this system. And we can go beyond that and say there's a value theory of the relation to nature and the metabolic relation to nature. That is, what presumption is there of this competitive system of production for extractivism from the natural world, from the extractive nature of resources and the like. So in my own case, I would want to say the value theory is not something which is sort of a fixed thing which explains relative prices, which a lot of Marxist economists, by the way, still try to work through. It's not about that at all in Marx. It's about something else, which is much more profound and I think much more interesting. Which is, why is it that this system, which grows up of commodity exchange under capitalist relations of production, why is it that this system can approach the exploitation of the labourers, the construction of systems of social reproduction, and the construction of certain metabolic relations with nature, and conditions of exploitation of traditional cultures and all the rest of it? Why is it that this system has these profound effects right across this whole totality? Now, nobody, I think, would want to go on from that to say that everything that happens in this totality is explainable in these terms. That is not what is being said. But what is being said is that you cannot understand much of what's going on within this totality without understanding what those terms are. And that therefore the value theory is a very, very important tool to look at things like environmental degradation, environmental deterioration, certain things that are happening within the world of social reproduction. But as Marx says very explicitly about all of these moments, the relation to nature and the distribution and that, they are autonomous but subsumed within the logic of the totality. This is the language that I would want to propose. They are autonomous and independent but subsumed within. And, you know, this is and he makes this, and I'll come back to this on Thursday when we talk more about Volume 3. He's very explicit that this is how we should think of the credit system. It's autonomous and independent but subsumed within the overall logic of the system. And, you know, people kind of say, well, this is a very crazy kind of concept. What does it mean? The only example I can give in my own life would be, it's like raising a teenager. They're always going on about their autonomy and their independence. But of course they're subsumed within the system, and when they get into trouble they come boom, Mommy, Daddy, can you please, deal with, I was shoplifting last week, did you know? Will you bail me out? This kind of stuff. And actually, I think kind of high-spirited teenagers is a very good way to describe what the financiers are like. I mean, they're mainly male, and their testosterone is very high level, and they go out and do crazy things, consider themselves masters of the universe, and then they do what happened in 2007, 2008, and what do they to say? Mummy, Daddy, State, please bail me out. And yes, indeed, Mummy, Daddy bails them out, and then they go back and start doing the same damn thing all over again, But it is like raising a teenager, I can tell you. It's kind of a particularly spirited one. So I think that we should use this notion of autonomous and independent moments and anecdote. I mean, for example, the metabolic relation to nature. Yeah, there's a lot that's going on here which has a lot to do with the way in which the value theory is forcing certain structures of extractivism to go on, and we can only understand that by understanding how it locates with that. But does this mean that we would explain something like the rise of new pathogens, say the rise of HIV/AIDS or something of that kind? The answer is no. That there's plenty going on in this world of, and sunspot cycles and things like that, or volcanic eruptions and so on. You can't, in other words, to say it is autonomous and independent but subsumed within is, I think, a very interesting way, because then you're obliged to talk about those aspects of what is happening in the world of social reproduction, or in the world of a metabolic relation to nature, or exploitation of culture. You're obliged to talk about it in terms of autonomous and independent developments and what's going on there, and the relation they might have to the overall circulation and accumulation of capital. And, there's an interesting kind of question. To what degree is the circulation and accumulation of capital a minor element in what is happening in, say, the world of distribution, or the world of metabolic relation to nature, or the world of social reproduction? Is it a minor irritation, or does it have major consequences? And that's something that needs to be discussed and debated and thought about and explored. But I think it's a useful framework to ask that question. And my own view is that there's much more impact than is often acknowledged when people start doing particular studies on, say, metabolic relation to nature, and there is a whole kind of wing of capitalist environmentalism, if you want to call it that presumes that all of this could be, everything could be taken care of without actually intervening in the value nexus, which is driving, and the value in motion, which is driving this system and how it's being driven. And this is a sort of question, and my own view, you have to accept my view. My view is that it's going to be very, very difficult to change some of these questions. And I think that this came out even over the question of social democracy and Ricardian socialism. That for a while there, so Ricardian socialism would actually, through its redistributive elements and through social democracy, actually created situations where both living and working were more tolerable than they had been for many years. But of course, what we've seen is a reversion to the less tolerable. And the reversion of that has had certain political consequences, such as increasing alienation, which produces increasing discontents and produces some very ugly political consequences. So again, it seems to me that having something of this kind is available to start to ask questions about, to what degree is it possible to reform capitalism so that it deals with some of these other questions about social reproduction, about metabolic relation to nature, about cultural history, indigenous rights, all those kinds of things. To what degree can capital actually be reconfigured in such a way so that it could become what they'd like to call now socially conscious capitalism? Is it possible, is it not? And I think an argument has to be made about that. And I'm not going to say a priori they're completely wrong, but I just think they are completely wrong. So let me stop here and sort of throw it open and get some. I mean, there are many other things I would want to say about Volume 1, but I think the essence of it is to say, read Volume 1 with the value theory in mind, but not the labour theory of value. Read it with the value theory of labour in mind. Yeah.
Well, yeah, this is something I was worrying about yesterday when you said that one of the realms of struggle that you're interested in is in the realisation of value in money form. And I was worried that, like, yeah, ethical consumerism or like concerned capitalism would fall into that realm as like a legitimate form of struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, ethical consumerism, it could form. It is a form of struggle, which again, there's an interesting point at which it becomes anti-capitalist, and a point at which it becomes, as it were, reformist. I tend to my politics lie, and if I can be confessional about it, with the idea that there are revolutionary reforms. And actually, Marx himself has an interesting formulation of that. In the volume 3 of Capital, Marx has this famous passage where Marx talks about, freedom really begins when the realm of necessity is left behind, which suggests that a world in which basic necessities, are fully provided to everybody is the basic starting point for the construction of a socialist alternative, which, by the way, is the Chinese version. I mean, when Deng Xiaoping started on his reforms, he basically said, we have something like at that time there was something like 840 million people defined as being living under conditions of abject poverty in China. We're not going to be able to do anything about that until we've left the realm of necessity behind and they've been drawn out of poverty. So they launch a complete sort of reform, which step by step becomes, in many respects, more and more capitalist. We can be snide and critical of it and say, well, they're just capitalists. But on the other hand, from 840 million people in poverty, they're now down to 40 million people in poverty. That is, they've actually got rid of about 800 million people in poverty in 25 years, which is a stunning performance. And it required capitalist technology, and this is again Marx's point on this, is to say that capitalist technology is crucial to any kind of socialist future, and therefore we can bring Chinese society to, and now they're really talking about the last Communist Party gathering came up with a proposition that they hoped to be a fully socialist society by 2050. Now you can do two things with this. You can kind of say, well, that's just a load of nonsense and it's all wishful thinking and it's all of that. But on the other hand, they've done some amazing things. But now, of course, in order to stabilize the economy, they have to launch into a middle-class consumerism. And to be in a Chinese city right now is to be in the midst of a consumerist society, which is kind of really going bananas. And you know, when you look at their city building and all the rest of it, is kind of crazy kind of stuff. So there's a big kind of question here. To what degree does capitalism provide a basis for an alternative of socialism, and to what degree is it possible to move towards a socialist society without actually doing what the Chinese are doing, which is essentially going through the capitalist phase right now, going through it like gangbusters, you know. I mean, it's just amazing sort of process. Now, what the ethics of this are is an interesting kind of conundrum. And, you know, I can have opinions about it, you can have opinions about it, but one of the things that I think we need to do is to have a very good theoretical understanding of the nature of capital and capital accumulation in order to have a standpoint from which we can say, well, what is or is not possible. I mean, the last 3 years I've been teaching this stuff in China, and it's been very, very interesting to actually sort of confront what the developmental process which is going on in China. I mean, everybody will accept this as a critique of what's happening to Western capitalism, but when you start to use it as a critique of what's going on in China, people kind of go, whoa, wait a minute, you know, we're socialist, you know, with Chinese characteristics. But you say, no, you're not, you're capitalist, but maybe it's a good idea you're capitalist, because some of the things you've been able to do by being capitalist are really quite stunning. And some of the disasters you've hit are also quite stunning. So, you know, you've got to deal with that. So I don't have when I say I'm interested in revolutionary reforms, one of these is proposed, in effect, in the chapter on the working day. I mean, Marx basically says, all right, individual capitalists working in their own self-interest are going to destroy the basis of the reproduction of the capitalist class. Therefore, there has to be some regulation. The state apparatus has to come in and regulate. And that regulatory apparatus is something that's agitated for by the working classes themselves, by what Marx calls classes with no direct interest in the question, but who had a moral standpoint, and bourgeois morality is important and has been historically important, and a recognition on the part of certain elements of the capitalist class that they were actually undermining their own futures by the kind of behaviors. Therefore, you get the 10 hours movement and the 8-hour movement and all those kinds of things, and we get a regulation of the length of the working day, length of the working week. But then there's an interesting kind of question of how far does this go? If you reduce the length of the working day to 8 hours, 5 days a week, one thing. If you start to say, well, we reduce it to 3 hours, 2 days a week, oh, wait a minute, this is way, way beyond. And Marx actually holds that out in the chapter on the working day. There's a sort of subtle passage where he kind of says, you know, there's a possibility here that you could really sort of and actually that passage about the realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity left behind. He says the first step is the regulation of the length of the working day. And actually the struggles over the length of the working day are very interesting. The French went through this recently, the 35-day week, and of course there's now an attempt to push it back in the other direction. I mean, the French, it's interesting. See, the French France has not become totally neoliberal in its labor relations. You still have, I don't know, 4 weeks vacation, and you still have a 35-hour week, and guess what? Every other country that's become totally neoliberal in its labor relations, like the United States and Britain and so on, shows incredible increase in social inequality. Piketty's book shows the one country that has not increased in social inequality is France. It's the one country that didn't get neoliberalized in its labor laws. What is Macron doing right now? He's trying to liberalize the labor laws. He's still trying. But the consequence of not liberalizing is being less, you know. So I think that there's a very, I mean there's a lot of process here. So when I say I'm in favor of revolutionary reforms, I'm interested in things like the the regulation of the length of the working week, working life, working everything, and these are reforms which, if you push them very hard and you push them to the point where you're working 3 days a week for 3 hours a day, then you're in a different kind of world. And to some degree, Marx himself took the view that one of the big signs of a socialist society is one in which there's an immense amount of free time, where people can do what the hell they like. And of course, what's interesting about our own society, and that's what gets back to socially unnecessary labour time, is we're kept occupied in all kinds of ridiculous ways for no good reason, and the amount of free time is less and less and less in a society where the amount of free time should be more and more and more. And this is one of the contradictions of contemporary capitalism, and it's one which needs to be sort of. But it arises out, in some ways, it all connects to the way in which the value theory still has this immense power in relationship to the circulation and accumulation of capital. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about this cycle. That in the beginning of the cycle, we see that money takes the form of capital. But we also know that money does not fall from thin air. In that regard, I want to ask that, what do you say about primitive accumulation in this table? And not in the first emergence of capital, but today's capitalist relations. With regard to that, what do you say about class constitution and the role of state when we think this primitive accumulation issue?
Yeah. In several places, I've worked quite a lot on what I consider to be the contemporary form of primitive accumulation, which is what I call accumulation by dispossession. I think there's a lot of primitive accumulation in the sense that Marx talked about it going on in the world. I think, for example, the conversion of the Chinese peasantry into wage workers is a classic form of primitive accumulation. The transformation of a lot of the Indian peasantry into wage workers in cities and so on is again another form of primitive accumulation. But there are forms of accumulation which are not about the creation of a wage labour force, but which are actually forms of appropriation of value of one segment of society by another. For example, if you look at the foreclosure process in the United States in 2007-2008, something like 6 or 7 million households lost their houses and lost their asset values. The net losses in African American communities were something of the order of, I don't know, 40 or 50 billion dollars of asset loss in a couple of years. So they lose 40, 50 million dollars. And in that year, the Wall Street bonuses were something like 40 or 50 billion dollars. And so you see a net transfer of wealth from poor African Americans and underprivileged African Americans, a net transfer of wealth to the upper classes. Now, I can't show that money actually went that way. All I know is that they lost 40 billion and they gained 40 billion, and I just make the inference that there's some relationship between the loss there and the gain here, particularly at a particular moment where there's aggregate losses everywhere. There are other forms of appropriation going on, which are, for instance, American Airlines, United Airlines, they've all filed for bankruptcy over the last 10 years. And when they file for bankruptcy, they immediately, one of the things they do is they go to the judge and they say, we can come out of bankruptcy provided we no longer have to honor our pension rights and our healthcare benefits. And the judge at some point says, yeah, okay, well, we need airplanes to fly, so we'll, just get rid of all of that. So suddenly people find themselves they've lost their pension benefits. Well, there's a state program that will step in, but maybe they were going to get $80,000 a year, and the state program gives them $35,000. So there's these losses. So there are these cumulative losses, and I mentioned yesterday the whole kind of George Soros taking a couple of $1 billion out of speculative gain. Now that's not primitive accumulation in the sense Marx talks about it, but it's what I call accumulation by dispossession. And accumulation by dispossession is often something that is engineered through the state apparatus. So when, for example, the judge says, yeah, you can go bankruptcy, that's the bankruptcy law. And bankruptcy law, is written by the state in such a way as to discriminate against, and to favor large corporations. So then you get the large corporations that are too big to fail and they therefore have to be bailed out. So this is kind of, So there's a lot. But again, accumulation by dispossession is an operation which is a continuation of primitive accumulation, but it's a continuation which also takes on different forms and has become extremely important in terms of the redistribution of wealth and power in what might be called the neoliberal period. So I think the state apparatus. Now this has also implications for class formation and for class appropriation. Again, how do we talk about the loss of asset values for an African American population through the housing crisis of 2007-2008? Is this a class phenomenon? Well, it's not a class phenomenon in the sense as it's workers versus capitalists, but it's financiers versus, for better or worse, certain dimensions of civil society. And therefore, if there's going to be a political response, it's going to have to be a political response that's organized through civil society, not one that's organized through trade unions in the workplace. Now, the interesting thing about the foreclosures, when you kind of said one of the things that was amazing in the United States was there was no political movement that came out of the foreclosures. Well, that's not quite true. There was one, but it was very weak and very small. Made, for the most part, because almost all of those people who lost their houses blamed themselves. This is a neoliberal ethic, which has gone so deep that kind of says, basically, if you have losses, it's because you were not responsible. I mean, what's a neoliberal ethic about? It's about being an entrepreneur in yourself, and this is a Foucauldian notion. You're an entrepreneur in yourself. If you lose, it's because you've been a bad entrepreneur or you've not invested in your human capital. And if you lose in the housing market, it's because you made bad decisions. Not because the housing market has been structured in such a way by capital to be able to steal as much money as possible from you. Not that at all. When you come up with that tale, people can look at you as if you're from Mars. But there is this kind of tendency to blame oneself. You blame the victim, they blame themselves, and this was going on in the housing market. It was terrible. I mean, the movement's going on, trying to support the movement's going on, but the movements were very weak and only managed to do a little bit of, getting people back into their housing. But there was a monstrous threat and a monstrous transfer of asset values during that housing crisis. And there was no political movement to stop it. And because everybody involved effectively blamed themselves. Yeah.
Well, I think that the thing that the motto of neoliberal ideology that it begins to withdraw the state as an active agent of the market and to cut its powers to intervene to the market relation. But we see that the contrary position during the crisis of 2007 and 8 is that. But anyway, what I mean is that.
Well, no, neoliberal politics was never about cutting the power of the state.
No, not in that sense.
It was always about reducing support for the social wage. That's the state changes.
At the same time, liberalization of the market, integration of the national markets through the integrated international markets, and control and cutting the state institutions that control the market relations, also on is a kind of.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. It wasn't cutting the control of the market relations. In fact, it was, in many respects, reorganizing.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
I am defending the opposition that the neoliberal organization of the state is strength the operational force of the state, especially in bureaucratic and military sense. But I am talking about what neoliberal ideologies defend in the first place.
Oh.
Anyway, but I am trying to say that, and you already said that, the state is not an agent of the relation between to operate the taxes, state expenditures, and providing health, education, and so on. Also, an active agent of capital accumulation today.
Yeah.
In that way, the role of state is missing in this sense.
Where the state operates in here, it's where there's taxes, and so you've got to get into the state apparatus at that point. Yeah, I agree. Sorry.
So my question kind of relates to the conversation you're having, which is that, so this element of the reproduction of labour power, it always seems to me to be pretty much the same as subject formation, which, and I know there's some kind of theoretical differences there, but that raises but then that raises a problem for this notion of the free gifts of human nature, because it feels like, so with the housing crisis that you're describing and the way that people are blaming themselves and the way in which people are exploited in the workplace, the way that the labour power is reproduced is with a blind spot for the free things that they're giving away all the time. So then my question is, what can we do about that in order to start thinking about reforms that are really going to help?
Right. Well, I think, one of the first things is to recognise the free gifts that are being given for what they are.
But how can you, when your whole subject formation or your whole production as a worker is with that blind spot as a central part?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, I was having this trouble with when the housing crisis hit in the States, which is, trying to say to people, this is a systemic problem. It's not your fault. But it's extreme. What can you do except have people out there who have a different perspective on it. And there were people there who had a different perspective and tried to organise people and the like, with some limited success. But it was a limited success. And actually, I think that was important, because I think right now what you're beginning to see is that limited success at that time is now actually, there is a historical memory that is being picked up that somehow or other we got screwed back then. And what are we going to do? We're not going to get screwed again, which is partly why there is this, for instance, within the Democratic Party in the United States, we're beginning to see the emergence of a more militant kind of base, who kind of says, the people who got us into this mess were the Clintonites, and they're the ones who kind of didn't get us out of this at all. In fact, the obvious thing to have done in 2007, 2008 would be to keep everybody in their housing by subsidizing homeowners so that they were kept in their housing. You try proposing that, and of course you were immediately kind of, you're a commie rascal, you know, all that kind of stuff. So there was never any serious discussion of that. Instead, you bail out the banks, and you bail out the people who've done the robbery. But I think what happened was then that there's an awareness, and actually Occupy started to create an awareness of that, and then so we've had, I'm just talking about the States in a way, we've had 10 years really of growing awareness that there's a real problem here, and the degree to which I think Sanders' movement and all the rest of it started to, so people are beginning to have it, but again it's still limited. And I think one of the issues that really disturbs me is that why are systems like this not being talked about in universities in any wide scale, you know, so one of the big issues is, so we've got to discuss this sort of stuff against the background of this kind. And yes, the question you ask is perfectly reasonable, but I don't have an answer to it.
Can I add something?
It's the kind of thing we have to find an answer to, you know, and I don't have any kind of magic kind of wand and say, yeah, we could do that. There's a...
Okay.
Just in terms of the concept of the totality, so my sort of prior understanding was in relation to exchange value, where it's not that there is this totality, but that exchange value has a totalizing effect, that anything can sort of potentially be drawn into it and like be sort of homogenized within that.
Yeah.
But I guess the sort of exchanging things through using a medium like money, it's not it's not unique to capitalism. So then I would think that it has to do with surplus value, maybe more than exchange value. Do you know what I mean? Like, just in regards to this idea of totality. But I'm not really sure where surplus value might come in there.
Well, what we're looking at here is the totality that is constructed through the process of the circulation and accumulation of capital. And exchange value is obviously a very important aspect of that, as is the production of surplus value. So all of these elements are, you don't single out one and say this is the one that... This is why I want to use a language of saying all of these elements are autonomous and independent but subsumed within, because that language allows you to sort of say, well, okay, let's look at the exchange value process, but let's see it as it is embedded in this whole totality. And so the purpose of the totality is to try to give a background and say, what is the context in which whatever it is we're studying works, so that if we're looking at social reproduction, we just don't take social reproduction as somehow or other outside of what is going on here, but we look at it in terms of its relationality to what else is going on within this totality, and the same would be true. So I think that the concept of the totality here is about trying to think through how all of these elements are interacting with each other, and how none of them are outside of each other, but at the same time they're autonomous and independent, so you can in fact ask questions about, for instance, the dynamics of social reproduction in contemporary society, which obviously there's a lot going on there which is independent of what I'm talking about here, but which is nevertheless affected by and connected to some of the things that are going on. So this is the framework that I'm trying to work through. I'm not sure this is answering your question.
I guess more like, not necessarily that this structure here is a totality, but that things become as commodities, as exchange values, become like totalized, or universalized, or however you want to put it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Well, they become universal. I mean, Marx's point is they become universalized through the rise of capital as a form of circulation and production. so that you cannot have a totality of this kind without capital accumulation and circulation, because that's what it's all about. And it's the formation of that totality. Now it's a formation. I mean, the big problem of this formulation of this kind is that it gets fetishized or it gets reified so that it becomes a thing instead of something that is a tentative formation which is constantly in transformation. And it's a dynamic kind of process, so that you start to look at its evolutionary path and its evolution. It's an evolutionary system. Yeah, somebody behind.
I guess I was just reflecting on what Owen was saying, and I work on food, and I work with I guess social movements that work within agriculture and food systems, and one of their main attempts is precisely to remove the commodity aspect from food,
right.
So decommoditize food.
Right.
So far, the only ways that I've seen that working is through discourses, so trying to, I guess, transform the way we speak about food, but also, I guess, the way we value food, if that makes sense. But I don't know in which other ways we could remove. So they talk about like food not being a commodity from the perspective of removing it from international trade, and trying to work with it more at the local level. So trying to remove food from this
Right.
so detotalizing
Right.
food, if that makes sense. But I don't know in which other ways. I was just reflecting on that it could be achieved with other I guess aspects of life or other elements.
I mean, there are a lot of movements of this sort, and I think questions of food sovereignty and so on are really interesting questions to look at, and I think that maybe it connects to the former question. It's not so much. In my experience of what you're talking about, it's not so much a question of decommodifying as asking how the commodity relations can actually work in a way where adequate food supplies are assured for a population and at a price which is reasonable. In other words, I don't think I would want to get into a situation in which I would say that all commodity relations are, quote, evil and therefore to be ignored. I think certain commodity relations work in certain ways which acknowledge the importance of food sovereignty, and certain commodity relations don't. For instance, I was involved in trying to protect a very large food market in Quito in Ecuador because first off, the market was on a rather high value site and the government wanted to tear it down and build a Hilton hotel on the site kind of thing. But the point was that about 60% of the food supply of Quito comes through these food markets. And a lot of the supply of those food markets comes from indigenous populations that are with indigenous agriculture and all the rest of it. The government seems to have the idea that it wants to abolish all those food markets, and it wants everybody to buy in the supermarkets, which are basically supplying food which is imported, so that instead of local tomatoes, you consume tomatoes produced in Holland or something of that kind. And now, here's a situation, it seems to me, where it's not a question of commodification, because both are commodified. The question is, how's it commodified and by what mechanism and to what degree? Because if the food markets are destroyed, essentially the whole base of food supply, which is actually, I mean, it's a very good example of food sovereignty in place, which could be enhanced, instead of which the government and the powers that be are trying to abolish that. So I think the struggle is over the protection of the limited forms of food sovereignty that exist through existing structures of commodification versus the kind of structures of commodification which are highly financialized and corporatized and based upon international trade relations, which, by the way, put Ecuador in a situation where instead of supplying its own food, which it perfectly well could do, it's increasingly having to sort of sell its energy resources in order to get the foreign exchange to import the food, which it could very well produce locally. So this whole kind of dynamic is something which is as a point of struggle. So I wouldn't want to say that commodification, at this point, again, it's revolutionary reforms, I wouldn't want to say that the abolition of the commodity relation is absolutely essential to the nature of what a political struggle might be about, because again, that food supply that comes into those markets coming from indigenous backgrounds contains what might be called a lot of social labor, which is of a very different sort than the social labor that's involved in what's going on in the production of tomatoes in Holland for marketing in Latin America. So I think that, you know, again, the politics of this are significant, but again, for me, the important thing was to try to protect the existing structures which were close to some degree of food sovereignty, and if possible to enhance them by actually having a project to make sure that Ecuador was completely self-sufficient in food supply, and that Quito and its region could be even seen as being pretty much self-sufficient in its food supply and its energy uses and the like. That those were political projects which wouldn't overthrow this system, but which actually start to move towards the creation of an alternative to the one which is actually being proposed right now, which is the kind of financialization and corporatization and industrialization of food supplies. Sorry, you were trying.
He's been waiting. You go before me.
Okay.
And then I'll go.
Okay,
Go.
yeah, okay, sorry.
Thank you.
This is quite a big question, so maybe it's better to wait, and maybe I'll talk to you
What?
another. This is quite a big
Go
question.
on, go for it, go for it.
So I'm interested in this autonomous and independent elements being subsumed within the logic of the system, of the totality, because I was thinking about the idea of what happens. Where do new elements come from? Do they come from? Obviously, they're the free gifts, but I'm talking about sort of maybe new modes of labour, etc.
Right.
Are they coming from outside the system? And if so, does that mean that the ones that you sort of touched on this a minute ago, but the ones that sort of emerge and stay because they are useful to the totality, useful to capitalism, or is the element produced by a need of the totality? So like this origin of these autonomous and independent elements, because I think this sort of produces some quite interesting questions about changes to the system and whether like to what extent are changes motivated, or to what extent are they evolutionary, or possibly both. And and I think this when we're sort of dealing with a lot of these ideas, especially when we're down in the nitty-gritty of a particular sort of system, you can usually follow quite a simple cause and effect chain of events, but as soon as you kind of try and abstract to the totality, that temporal model just seems to collapse. And I think, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can sort of think that issue through, and how we can kind of bring that out in when we sort of think politically of Marx.
Well, I think some of the innovations, if you want to call it that, are come internally, and some come outside. I mean, again, if I look at the case of China, which I'm increasingly becoming familiar with, the Central Committee in China is interested in outcomes. what it basically does is to say, here there's a problem, and it basically invites everybody in China, and it's highly decentralized, which most people don't realize, highly decentralized, basically says to everybody, we've got a problem, go out and see if you can solve it. And everybody, incentives are structured in such a way that people just go out like crazy and try and solve it, and eventually somebody comes up with a kind of solution, and then the central government kind of says, that's the outcome we want, so this is now going to be the model that everybody should follow because this is one that works and gives us the outcome we want. So this is a thing which is defined in terms of what are the outcomes. Like we want to have an outcome of increased output in agriculture. How do we do it? Under the communal system, it wasn't working. Somebody came up with a household responsibility system and it worked, and so they said, okay, we'll go with a household responsibility system. So there's a process internal, and this is a response to a need, but it's also an internal, so it's partly internal. But then things become external. For instance, how do you respond to a SARS epidemic or a Zika epidemic, or you know, these you know, these are not things that are sort of dictated by the systemic needs. They're questions which are posed by external dynamics and independent dynamics, and which require therefore a systemic response. So I don't see it as being either internal or external. I see it, sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, sometimes it's, there is a clear way. I mean, and I think what's so impressive to me about China, for all of its problems, is there's a very clear way in which they define what is the nature of the problem. And there's a very clear way in which they therefore invite innovations of any sort that will help solve the problem. For instance, the crisis of 2007-2008, China scarcely experienced it, because they were already in a process of huge expansion, and they simply said, oh, if there's a problem, we just double our rate of expansion. So all of the aggregate data in China, I mean, China created something like 27 million jobs in 1 year. Well, how do you do that? And then I was stunned when I sort of found this, and I thought, well, how do we... It then turned out that China has been creating 20 million jobs every year for about the last 15 years anyway. So to create 27 million jobs was no big deal. I mean, it was just like up a bit. But the outcome was, of course, that China absolutely expanded dramatically over 2007-2008, had almost no experience of the crisis. By its demand for raw materials, it actually revived the economies of Chile and Brazil and Australia. So anybody who was connected to the China trade came out of 2007 and 8 pretty fast. Because that's what the Chinese were doing, and they had an outcome. Here's something that is, to them, is an external shock, which is the collapse of the export market in the United States and the collapse of the export industries inside of China. So what do? They say, oh, well, we'll build 5 more towns and 5 more cities, and we'll build a high-speed rail network. And we had 0 miles of high-speed rail network in 2008. They've now got nearly 20,000 miles. Built in 10 years. I mean, what is this? I mean, this is so. The point is that the response to this is something which is very. If it's very clearly articulated, understanding what the nature of the problem is, then there can be a clear response. What is so interesting, it seems to me, about what's going on in contemporary capital. Throughout, say, Europe and North America, is that nobody's clear about what the nature of the response should be. apart from the fact that the ruling class, the top 1%, wants to increase its wealth and power, and is doing so extremely well, and has done very well through the crisis, while the rest of us have had to take austerity and all the rest of it. So the system is malleable and flexible. And one of the things I did in the book was to start to talk about, well, this system is regionally disaggregated. The tendency in Marx's theory is to kind of say, well, there's only one value structure. I think there are different value regimes in the world right now. And actually they're increasingly defined, and they're becoming increasingly prominent in terms of the sorts of things that are going on right now. There's a distinctive European value regime which is trying to be held together in the European Union, but it's under a lot of internal stress, but it's a value regime which is very different from NAFTA, which is a value regime which is also under stress, which is very different from China and the Chinese regional hegemony, if you want to call it that. So there are different value regimes, and they're in competition with each other, but they're also in relation to each other. And problems are arising in each one of them, and sometimes they're external problems. What to do about climate change? I mean, what to do about new pathogens, new disease structures, what to do. So those are issues which require response. And the responsiveness within the system is it's very remarkable how weak the response has been in the capitalist world since 2007, 2008, with the exception of increasing the levels of social inequality and increasing the concentrations of wealth and power in an oligarchy that increasingly looks like kleptocracy, because they're basically robbing the world of value through accumulation by dispossession as opposed to actually making anything. So, these are the ways I would want to start to talk about this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to take up her point. I thought this point about the free gifts of human nature and subject formation and the blind spot. And I just, this is a question. When your first year here at the summer school, Etienne Balabar was doing a genealogy on human capital,
right,
and Wendy Brown was using Marx and Foucault to think financialization. And one of the things that they sort of, in conversation, produced in the debates was the fact that the human subject has undergone a loss of capacity because something is squashed out. As you transform into being a mere speck within the protocols of integrated world capital, there's a loss of perhaps, I don't know where one might mark it, but there's a loss. There's a transformation of human nature. There's a transformation of capacity in the subject. And a responsiveness in the subject because something is squashed out. And I think somebody produced a quote from Marx where he literally talks about a kind of squashing out of the life. So you also mentioned about infinity on your first day here. And I'm just thinking how psychoanalysis is dealing with this question, because they all are, all the contemporary clinics in psychoanalysis, the thinking, the political, the rise of populism and the crisis in democracy, and they're thinking libidinal economy and how the drive is linked into this more, this bad infinity, and how one might produce the limit and how one might reactivate capacities in the subject that could produce some kind of resistance, could make interventions. And I'm thinking of what you did then just making another leap, I'm thinking of what you did in your keynote, your keywords of space, on space. You did a matrix on space, and then you redid it, thinking of where it might go using Marx. And I'm thinking of your text in the Spaces of Hope on Utopia. I'm just wondering how, if you redid this, but in terms of how one might produce different forms of commodity, different sets of relation, activate capacities, produce different forms of, if not valorization, but some other word. You know, how one might make a circuit that didn't look like that, but that looked like more closer to your utopian, that produced limits and gave subjects the ethics to deal with a limit against of more. For instance, this is just a thought.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe this would be the final
yeah.
comment.
Well, it's such a complicated comment. I'm not going to deal with it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about alienation, because I think my approach to what you're talking about is largely through a revitalization of Marx's theory of alienation. I'll talk about that
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow or the day after, or sometime.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.